Hi, I just wanted to share a little bit about the paper that I'm submitting for the symposium, Stories Hold Our Cure, Finding Connection Through Comedy in Hannah Gadsby's Nanette. Before I get into some of my findings and major points, I just wanted to say I originally wrote this paper this summer, 2022, for my Representing Love, Sex, and Disability course. And it came from a place of I'm someone who loves stand-up and loves comedy and loved Nanette when it originally came out in 2018. And it had such an impact on me then. It continues to have an impact on me now. And I can say that no matter how many times I see it, it is still just as powerful. I often describe the experience of watching it as a gut punch because it is very intense. It doesn't matter how many times I see it, I experience that every single time. But I also was interested in doing this because one of her major points that Gadsby discussed, and this is in my last slide, she says, I have to quit comedy. And what she means by that is she has to stop dealing with her trauma through making jokes. And if I'm completely honest, that's exactly how I deal with my own trauma. That's exactly how I deal with my emotions and my depression. I make jokes about it. And I think that a lot of people do that. That's really relatable. But to hear someone confront that and directly share her trauma and say, I'm not going to do that anymore. I'm not going to bury it in jokes for you, really hit me hard personally and made me think about how I need to deal with my own and cope better. And her major argument is that we need to cope through creating community, through sharing our stories with each other. And I really love that. And I think that that's why this is so important. That's why Nanette, even though it's 2023 and this premiered in 2018, she wrote it in 2017. That's why Nanette is still important. Because not only is she confronting hegemonic patriarchy and homophobia and really, I think that piece was such almost a capsule of the Me Too movement. But more than that, those issues are still happening. These are ideas that we still need to confront. This is still important, and it doesn't matter what year she wrote that in, that it still has the same power that I think it had when it first came out. Okay, so let me share my project with you. I'm sure I'm already over time, so I'm going to try to be really quick, and my apologies. Here's my first slide. I just want to describe on screen. I have a photo of Gadsby during her performance. I also have a photo of her book, 10 Steps to Nanette, which came out in 2022. She calls it a memoir situation, but she also talks about some of the most pivotal moments that led up to her writing the show, Nanette. And I use both the book and also quotes from Gadsby's performance throughout my paper too. If you haven't seen Nanette, you can watch it on Netflix. It's a special just over an hour long that was filmed in 2018 in the Sydney Opera House. And throughout the show, she is interweaving trauma, mental illness, and recognizing her emotions, her sensitivity as strength. And yes, it is a comedy show. There are parts that are funny, but ultimately I would say that this is a disability story that is infused with comedy. And so by disability here, I mean trauma as disability. I mean mental illness as disability. These are all ideas that she talks about throughout the show. So just a few of my main points here. My major argument is that here in Nanette, Gadsby is breaking comedic norms through this concept of disidentification by Jose Munoz, which is this idea of coming from queer of color critique of a way to deal with the dominant ideology as working both on and against it. So not assimilating, but also not directly opposing it. I have to apologize if you can hear my cat is scratching on my closed door, so excuse her. But throughout this show, she is diverting from these traditional comedic norms. And in doing so, she is condemning systemic homophobia, misogyny, compulsory heteronormativity, and hegemonic patriarchy as well, while she's grappling with her trauma and sharing her story. And there is a major tonal shift from the first half of the show to the second half of the show. So the first half of the show feels like a comedy show. You're laughing, you're having a good time, you're getting comfortable. And then in the second half of the show, she takes all that comfort away. And she describes really following this arc of trauma, in that she is in a show about trauma. She's also making the audience experience trauma. So the second half of the show is not funny. It's not meant to be funny. It is serious. It is tense. There is so much tension in the room, and it truly, there is no release. There's no relief either. It can be uncomfortable to watch even, but that second half of the show, that's where she's condemning patriarchy and misogyny and homophobia, and that's also where she's sharing her own trauma and telling the audience directly what happened to her. And in that, she's talking about her sexual abuse, her rape, and her physical abuse as part of a hate crime against her as a queer woman. And it is a stark contrast, and it stops feeling like a comedy show. And that second half is so important. The other thing I talk about too is it's filmed differently than a regular comedy show. You're used to seeing the audience members laugh, enjoy themselves. You're used to seeing the comic walk around. She does not move at all. She plants her feet exactly center stage. She does not pick up her feet at all. On top of that too, the way it is filmed, that second half especially, it is mostly close-ups, usually from the shoulders up. And what that does is, especially in that second half, when she is making so much tension, you can't look away. And I don't mean that as somebody, I mean, sure, you can look away from your TV, but literally as the viewer, you cannot look away from her face because the camera doesn't go anywhere else. So you are forced to make eye contact with her, essentially. And it is really jarring, and like I said, at times uncomfortable too. But what that does is, not only does it make the viewer feel slightly uncomfortable because they can't stop looking at her, it also makes them feel incredibly connected to her too, which is ultimately one of her major points at the end of the show, is that it's about coping through connection, through community, and asking the audience to witness her, connect with her, find themselves in her own traumatic experiences. And you can't help but do that when you look directly at her face for however long that second half is. You have to connect with her on a human to human level. So another thing I just want to mention, throughout the show, she says this quote, "I have to quit comedy." I just want to talk a little bit about what she means by that. So on the screen here, I have 3 pictures of her and a couple of quotes that are just one of her major ideas about quitting comedy. She says, "I built a career out of self-deprecating humor. That's what I built my career on, and I don't want to do that anymore." And by that, she means, as somebody who has a marginalized identity, coming from a marginalized community as a queer woman, she is saying that in her former styles of comedy, when she was self-deprecating, that her argument is that when you're self-deprecating yourself as a queer person or a marginalized person, you're not just doing it to yourself, you're doing it to your community. And so she's ending that practice. She also is saying, by quitting comedy, that she is rejecting her former practice of burying her trauma in jokes. And instead of doing that, instead of letting the audience laugh about her trauma, she's sharing it outright. And by outright, what I mean is that's when she's talking about her sexual abuse, her rape, the violence. But her major point in doing so is that's when she's condemning homophobia, misogyny, hegemonic patriarchy too. And ultimately, like I said, she's ending with that call to connection with the audience, and asking the audience to witness her. What she's really saying is that this story is not just about overcoming her trauma, overcoming disability either. It's not about that, but it's actually about coping with trauma through community, through human to human connection. And I think that's so important. So with that, I know I've gone way over time. My apologies. I just want to thank you so much. I appreciate it, and I'll end it here.